Pull your gaze away from those sun-drenched Mediterranean coasts, the white marble temples, and those bright agoras where philosophers whisper. Because while that gilded cradle of civilization was worshipping its own hubris, the true masters of Europe were awakening in the foggy, pitch-black, and boundless oak forests of the north. This mysterious people, whom the ancient Greeks called Keltoi, Celts, and the Romans called Galli, Gauls, were not the primitive savages eating leaves in the forest and charging around mindlessly screaming, as history books try to make us swallow. They were Europe's first true, first ruthless, and first colossal superpower, while Rome was still an ordinary village living in mud huts. The secret of this power spanning the continent from end to end was hidden not in philosophy or marble statues, but in a heavy, freezing, and lethal material forged in the depths of those dark forests. Iron. Around 800 BC, in those cold lands that fall within the borders of modern-day Austria and Switzerland, the Hallstatt culture. A silent revolution took place that changed the course of human history. While the arrogant states of the Mediterranean were still showing off with fragile and expensive bronze weapons, the Gauls managed to melt the stubborn and hard rock of the earth and fire and give it shape. They were the most flawless metallurgists of the ancient world. The Lords of Iron! From within those dark forests rose not only the howling of animals, but the deafening, rhythmic screams of heavy hammers coming down upon colossal anvils. Gallic blacksmiths were not merely making weapons. They were breathing souls into the iron, engraving those complex, hypnotizing Latin motifs onto their swords. Over time, this mastery transformed into the pure savagery of the art of war. While the Romans still marched onto the battlefield with short, simple blades, the Gauls were making Europe tremble with colossal longswords forged from steel, heavy shields that shattered enemy weapons in seconds, and those lethal chariots considered the tanks of the ancient world. Furthermore, the inventors of that famous chainmail attributed to knights today were the Gauls themselves. The sight of a Gallic warrior armed to the bone on the battlefield was a complete psychological devastation for the disciplined but small-statured soldiers of the south. Imagine a killing machine running at you, much taller than the Romans, muscular, washing their hair with lime water to make it spike up pure white, sporting mustaches, and swinging their colossal swords over their heads. Those screams on the battlefield were not just an explosion of anger. They were a flawless psychological warfare tactic aimed at paralyzing the enemy's mind before the swords even clashed. However, what truly made the Gauls dangerous was that they were not under the command of a single king or a single capital like Rome or the Persians. There was no Gallic empire. They were a massive, chaotic network divided into hundreds of different tribes, like the Arverni, the Senones, and the Boii, slaughtering each other in blood feuds yet sharing the same language, the same art, and the same dark faith. They had no borders, for their border was wherever their horses could reach and their swords could cut. Being scattered did not weaken them. On the contrary, it allowed them to spread across the entire continent like an uncapturable, invincible virus, born in those colossal, dark forests of Europe. This culture of iron and blood was beginning to outgrow its own borders. Tribes were expanding, the population was increasing, and those cold northern winds were shifting southward, toward the Mediterranean where wealth, wine, and gold flowed, while those arrogant countries of civilization slept in complacency, believing they were safe behind colossal mountains. The Lords of Iron were preparing to descend from the snowy peaks of the Alps as the greatest wave of plunder and blood history had ever seen. Yet, it was not kings or commanders orchestrating these massive tribes. These savage warriors like a conductor, making them fearless of even death on the battlefields. The minds of these warriors were entirely in the palms of that mysterious priest class with a freezing intellect and blood-stained hands, the Druids, who hid in the depths of those dark oak forests and absolutely refused to put anything in writing. The swords of the Gauls may have been made of steel, but what truly made them invincible were those bloody rituals they offered to the gods in the depths of that forest. We have grasped the colossal steel swords of the Gauls and their industrial savagery on the battlefields. Yet, you cannot rule a massive society, hundreds of distinct and bloody tribes, with iron alone. You must dominate their minds, their souls, and their deepest fears. This is where the darkest and most flawless intelligence network of Europe, before whom even kings, tribal chiefs, and those terrifying warriors trembled and knelt, entered the picture. The Druids. Completely erase from your mind that pop culture fairy tale of the white-bearded, herb-gathering, nature-loving, and peaceful wizard grandpa. In the reality of the ancient world, the Druids were an untouchable and freezing ruling class that orchestrated politics, justice, education, and war from a single epicenter. They were the absolute judges who placed kings on the throne or dethroned them with a single word, decreed wars, and resolved blood feuds among the tribes. They were so overwhelmingly powerful that, as Julius Caesar recorded in sheer astonishment, when two Gallic armies drew their swords and charged at one another, if a single white-robed Druid walked into the middle of the battlefield and raised his hand, those thousands of bloodthirsty warriors were forced to lower their weapons and kneel. What was the secret behind this unshakable power? The greatest and most chilling weapon of the Druids was not the sword. It was Galanza. The Gauls possessed their own language and could actively use the Greek alphabet for trade, but the Druids strictly forbade the transcription of sacred knowledge, laws, and history onto parchment. Why? Because knowledge was power. If you wrote it down, that knowledge became ordinary, fell into the hands of the plebeians, or could be stolen by the enemy during a war. To become a Druid, you had to enter the depths of those dark forests and memorize the movements of the stars, the laws of nature, complex philosophy, and all the desires of the gods for exactly 20 years. By outlawing writing, they became the sole possessors of the truth and the word of the gods on earth. They locked their dominion inside their immense memories, an impenetrable fortress that could never be besieged. However, the most dangerous asset the Druids bestowed upon Gallic society was not a philosophy, but a flawless psychological weapon. They instilled in those savage warriors a doctrine that the Mediterranean basin, the Romans, and the Greeks could never comprehend. The lie that death was merely an illusion. According to Druidic belief, the human soul was immortal. When the body died, the soul simply departed for a brief moment and was immediately reborn in another body, reincarnation. This is precisely the origin of that suicidal fearlessness on the battlefield that utterly terrified the Roman legionaries. For a Gaul, being put to the sword in combat was not an end, but merely a minor change of scenery. They defied death to such a degree that, according to ancient sources, when lending money to one another, they would arrange for the debt to be repaid in the next life. How can you defeat an army that does not fear death, but instead charges toward it with a laugh? Yet, this spiritual and immortal world came with a freezing, bloody price tag. The gods were not always generous, and when the balance of nature was disrupted, a toll had to be paid. When famine struck, when a plague spread, or when a massive war arrived at the gates, there was only one way to appease the deities: human blood. Deep within the forests, the Druids stripped away their nature-lover masks and presided over their bloody rituals. They constructed colossal human effigies out of wood and dried branches, which they called the Wicker Man. They crammed thieves, criminals, and sometimes innocent prisoners of war into these claustrophobic cages so tightly that they could barely breathe, and then set these statues ablaze alive, illuminating the pitch-black night. The horrific screams of the people engulfed in flames blended with rhythmic drumming and the monotonous chants of the Druids. While those screams tore through the silence of the forest, they were actually cementing the most solid guarantee of the Druids' power. The gods demanded blood, and they were the sole authority capable of offering that blood without flinching. By the time the 4th century BC arrived, these dark forests of Europe had transformed into a colossal volcano ready to erupt. Hundreds of thousands of warriors, armed with iron swords, absolutely fearless of death thanks to the Druids' indoctrination, and starving for wealth, could no longer be contained within those woods. That freezing northern wind was about to turn sharply to the south, and Gallic swords would mercilessly batter the gates of that arrogant civilization, that false eternal city, which believed itself invincible at the center of the world. Rome was about to meet the greatest nightmare of its existence. Hundreds of thousands of Gauls, who had torn the fear of death from their minds through the bloody rituals of the Druids, could no longer be contained within the cold and dark forests of Europe. By the year 390 BC, that colossal migration began, one that would fundamentally alter the course of European history. Loading their women, children, and spoils onto ox carts, the tribes strapped on their massive swords, crossed the snowy peaks of the Alps, and descended beneath the fertile, warm sun of Italy. Their target was that arrogant city growing day by day, swallowing the weak Italian tribes around it, and fancying itself the sole center of the world and civilization. Rome. Rome was a young republic that had not yet transformed into that massive empire, but its hubris was far greater than its stature. When the Senate heard that the Gauls had entered Italy and were advancing southward, burning and destroying everything in their path, they did not even take it seriously. They viewed this colossal danger approaching their borders as an ordinary rebellion by a few hundred uncivilized marauders. In fact, the commanders leading the army were so arrogant that when they faced the Gauls on the banks of the Alesia River, they did not even deign to perform the sacred sacrificial rituals to the gods required before battle. They were absolutely certain they would crush and trample these naked barbarians, who came tearing through the forest before them in a matter of hours. However, on the banks of the Alesia River, Rome's hubris turned into a bloody nightmare within seconds. Standing before them was not a herd of marauders. It was a flawless killing machine. Men far taller than they were, faces painted with chalk, wearing animal pelts, and swinging their colossal iron swords above their heads. When the battle commenced, the freezing war cries of the Gauls paralyzed the psychology of the Roman legions before the swords even clashed, feeling absolutely no fear of death thanks to the indoctrination of the Druids. The Gauls slammed into the Roman lines with such suicidal ferocity that Rome's famous defensive line was torn apart like paper. The long, heavy steel swords of the Gauls cleaved Roman shields, armor, and bones alike in two with a single strike. It was not a battle. It was a one-sided massacre. A vast portion of the Roman army drowned in the river, while the rest dropped their weapons and fled in terror. The capital city of Rome was now completely defenseless. The gates of the sacred city were wide open. When the charismatic and ruthless leader of the Gauls, Brennus, arrived at the gates of Rome with his army, there was not a single soldier on the city walls. The gates were open. At first, the Gauls assumed this was a trap. With cautious steps, they entered those magnificent marble streets. The city was abandoned. The populace and the few surviving soldiers had taken refuge in the small fortress on the Capitoline Hill. Yet, when the Gauls reached the Forum, the center of the city, they encountered a bone-chilling, surreal sight. Rome's oldest aristocrats, senators, and former consuls, dressed in their ornate ceremonial robes, sat completely motionless and silent, like statues on their ivory chairs, holding their staffs in their hands. They had not fled. By sacrificing the city to the gods, they were fulfilling that ancient, honorable Roman tradition. A Gallic warrior, trying to figure out if these figures were statues or humans, approached and pulled the long, white beard of an elderly senator. The senator brought his staff down hard upon the Gaul's head. That single blow initiated the apocalypse of Rome. Within seconds, the Gauls drew their swords, hacked those elderly aristocrats to pieces in their ivory chairs, and then set fire to the sacred city considered the center of the world. Rome burned for days. Temples were pillaged, and buildings were reduced to ash. When the Romans began to starve to death under a months-long siege on the Capitoline Hill, hubris was replaced by absolute despair. The Senate begged Brennus to leave the city and agreed to pay him a colossal ransom, exactly 327 kilograms of pure gold. A massive scale was set up in the square. As the gold was being weighed, the Romans noticed the scales were rigged and that the Gauls had tampered with the weights, prompting them to protest. That invincible Roman honor had stooped low enough to haggle over a few pieces of gold. It was in that exact moment that Brennus made the legendary move that froze the course of history. He looked down at the Romans with disdain, drew his heavy, colossal iron sword from his belt, and slammed it onto the pan of the scale. As the scale crashed down with a loud clatter, Brennus locked eyes with the Roman senators and whispered that venomous phrase, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. This statement was not the cry of a barbarian. It was a freezing slap across the fake face of hubris and civilization. Whoever held the power made the rules. Rome had lost not only its gold and its city, but also its belief in its own invincibility. As the Gauls took the gold and cheerfully returned north, they left behind a burning city and a horrific trauma that would be etched into Rome's genetic code for centuries and passed down from generation to generation. Metus Gallicus, the Gallic terror. Rome would never forget this trauma. It would never again be able to turn its back to those forests. Yet, the fear the Gauls would inflict upon the world was not limited to Italy alone. They had tasted the gold and the blood of the south. The fire lit by Brennus would soon be stoked once more to turn another bastion of civilization, the untouchable sacred temple at the very heart of Greece, into a pool of blood. The smoking ruins of Rome and Brennus's scale had left a horrific message at the heart of the ancient world. The gilded civilizations of the south were rich and arrogant, but entirely helpless against iron and savagery. When the Gauls returned to the northern forest with colossal loot from Italy, the stories they told grew like a toxic seed in the minds of new generations. After a century had passed, in 279 BC, the unending hunger of the forest awakened once more. This time, the target was a place far greater, far more untouchable, and far more sacred than the false hubris of Rome. The new leader of the Gauls, who also bore the title Brennus, like his ancestor, had set his sights on the true cradle of philosophy, art, and the gods, Greece. But he did not want just an ordinary city. He wanted the omphalos of the ancient world, the legendary Temple of Delphi, considered the very navel of the universe, before which kings knelt. Delphi was not merely an ordinary place of worship. It was the greatest intelligence center and the most colossal treasury of the ancient world. For centuries, Greek city-states, Egyptian pharaohs, and Persian kings had piled tons of pure gold, priceless statues, and offerings here just to learn the future from the famous oracle of Apollo. For the Greeks, to touch Delphi meant declaring a direct war on the gods. What protected this temple was not walls or massive armies. It was the deep, absolute fear of divine wrath. Yet, to Brennus and his warriors, who did not fear death and were enchanted by the Druids' magic of reincarnation, the gods, temples, or philosophy of the South meant absolutely nothing. To them, Apollo was nothing more than a comical idol made of gold, waiting to be melted down. As this colossal Gallic flood began to pour down from the Balkans toward Greece, they first encountered the kingdom of Macedonia. The supposedly invincible legacy of Alexander was shredded like paper before the Gallic swords. The army of the Macedonian king Ptolemy Ceraunus was annihilated in a matter of hours. The king's head was severed from his torso and impaled on a Gallic spear, falling victim to that famous severed head ritual, spreading sheer terror across all of Greece. The panicked Greeks attempted to hold the pass of Thermopylae, just as they had done against the Persians centuries prior. However, with his freezing intellect, Brennus did not force the pass. Instead, he bypassed it, flanked the Greek army from behind, and utterly shattered them. Now, there was absolutely no obstacle remaining between the slopes of the sacred Mount Parnassus, where the Temple of Delphi stood, and the bloodthirsty swords of the Gauls. On a foggy and freezing winter morning, the Gallic army, massive in stature, bare-chested, beating their shields, and unleashing savage war cries, arrived at the gates of the temple. Greek historians embellished that day with mystical lies to save their own honor. They wrote that Apollo hurled lightning bolts from the sky, tore colossal rocks from the mountain, and protected the temple with a magical storm. Yet, the freezing face of reality was entirely different. The Gauls ruthlessly smashed the sacred doors of the temple. Upon entering, they put those arrogant priests, who had determined the fate of humanity for centuries, to the sword. When Brennus stepped inside the temple, he looked at the Greeks' muscular, bearded, marble statues of God shaped in the human silhouette, and burst into laughter. For a Gaul who believed in the spirits of the forest and sought gods in trees and storms, fashioning a god to resemble his own frail body was the ultimate foolishness. On that day in Delphi, religion knelt before the sword. Tons of golden offerings, silver vessels, and jewels accumulated over centuries were stuffed into the sacks of the Gauls. Blood and wine flowed together, pooling on the temple floor. The gods of the south had died. That sacred aura, once thought invincible, was eternally shattered by the iron of the north. While Greece convulsed from this trauma, this colossal Gallic army, satiated with blood and gold, could no longer march toward a single target. They split into two. While one faction remained in Thrace, the other branch, hungrier, more savage, and lusting for even greater loot, turned its eyes eastward, toward where the sun rises. They set forth to plunge their swords across that massive sea, straight into the very heart of the oldest of civilizations, Anatolia. One of the longest and bloodiest migrations history has ever witnessed would carry those children of the forest into those arid lands, right into the very core of modern-day Ankara, which, centuries later, would come to be known as Galatia. The colossal Gallic flood that stained the marble floor of the Delphi temple with blood and stuffed the gold of the gods into sacks had now transformed into an unstoppable phenomenon of nature. However, after plundering Greece, A portion of this savage horde did not turn their faces back home to those dark forests. They turned their eyes toward where the sun rises, to Anatolia, the cradle of legends and ancient civilizations. In 278 BC, a Gallic army of approximately 20,000, half of whom were women, children, and slaves, crossed the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits, setting foot on Asian soil. At that time, Anatolia was a colossal chessboard boiling with intrigue and blood, where Alexander the Great's commanders fought among themselves for the throne. King Nicomedes I of Bithynia committed the deadliest and most foolish mistake in history to crush his rivals. He personally invited these bloodthirsty forest warriors to Anatolia by hiring them as mercenaries. The king assumed he could control these brainless barbarians with gold and use them like leashed guard dogs. Yet, domesticating the Gauls was no different from locking a pack of hungry wolves inside a sheepfold. When their contracts expired, the Gauls did not return home. They turned their weapons on those who hired them and upon the wealthy cities of Anatolia. Western Anatolia instantly turned into a living hell. From Troy to Ephesus, those magnificent Ionian cities were shaken by the terror of these half-naked, fearless warriors wielding colossal steel swords. Kings were forced to pay them massive tributes called the Galatian tax, just to keep their cities from being burned to the ground. The Gauls were now a deadly, unremovable parasite clinging to the jugular vein of Anatolia. The task of ending this nightmare and saving the civilization whose hubris had been shattered fell to the Seleucid emperor, Antiochus I, at the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, or, according to some sources, the plains of Manisa. Two colossal powers faced one another. The Gauls were certain they would unleash yet another massacre with their famous war chariots, heavy swords, and freezing war cries. However, Antiochus brought forth an entirely different nightmare against the children of the forest, one they had never seen in their lives. One that would paralyze their minds, colossal, armored war elephants brought from India. When the battle commenced, the Gallic horses panicked upon sensing the strange scent and horrific cries of the elephants, fleeing back into their own lines. Those supposedly invincible Gallic warriors were literally crushed beneath the feet of the elephants, suffering a colossal defeat for the first time. This battle, recorded in history as the Battle of the Elephants, halted the Gauls' reign of terror in western Anatolia. However, they could not completely wipe them out. Just like a wild animal, the Gauls became even more dangerous when cornered. To drive them away from the wealthy coasts of the west, the kings banished them to the harsh, arid, windy, and ruthless steppes of central Anatolia, right into the very heart of Phrygia. By an incredible twist of fate, this people born in the foggy, rainy, and lush forests of Europe found themselves trapped in the middle of entirely yellow steppes. But they did not perish. They sealed this harsh geography with their own blood and gave it that freezing name in history: Galatia. 3 major tribes named the Tectosages, Talistobogi, and Trachmi divided this massive steppe among themselves to dominate those endless plains. The Gauls chose steep and rocky hills. The Tectosages tribe, in particular, built a massive fortress atop an impenetrable, steep rock rising in the middle of the plain, and made it their capital. The place they called Ankara, was none other than Ankara itself, the very place where millions of people walk today, living their daily lives around that famous fortress. Yes, the streets where the dry steppe wind blows today once echoed with the battle cries of chainmail-clad Celtic warriors with lime-spiked hair, while the freezing, bloody rituals of the Druids resonated on the rocky hills above. Right in the navel of Anatolia, surrounded by all the empires of the East, a European kingdom nourished by wine and blood was born. They had now established their own state, but they never gave up on fighting and shedding blood. Cultivated in those harsh steppes of Galatia, these terrifying warriors would soon become the most sought-after, most expensive, and most dangerous killing machines of the ancient world. From the deserts of Egypt to the shores of Carthage, kings would pour sacks of gold onto these barbarians of the steppe just to have them sever the heads of their enemies. Whether the Gauls trapped in those yellow and harsh steppes of Anatolia, namely Galatia, or the Celtic tribes remaining in the foggy forests of the north, wherever they were, war and blood were a freezing art etched into their genetic codes. From the 3rd century BC onward, the kings, emperors, and generals of the ancient world had to accept a very bitter reality. If you wanted not merely to defeat your enemy, but to shatter their mind and drown their army in a pool of blood, you had to give your gold to these children of the forest. The Gauls had become the most terrifying, most ruthless, and most expensive killing machines history had ever seen. The world's first colossal mercenary industry. However, what distinguished these men from ordinary mercenaries was their famous and freezing psychological warfare tactic, the cult of the severed head. For the Gauls, the human soul resided not in the heart, but inside the head. Killing their enemies on the battlefield was insufficient for them. The true victory was taking the enemy's soul captive. A Gallic warrior would sever the head of a respected commander or noble soldier he had slain from their torso with a single sword strike, lift it into the air by the hair, and hang that bloody trophy around his horse's neck. When the battle ended, they would return home like proud hunters, with blood dripping from the severed heads on their horses' necks. They embalmed the skulls of their strongest enemies with special cedar oils, kept them in wooden chests, and displayed them to guests arriving at their homes as a badge of honor. Roman historians recorded in horror that a Gaul would refuse to sell these embalmed heads even for their weight in gold. It was this psychopathic tradition, combined with the Druidic belief that death is merely a new beginning, that made them the most flawless shock troops, vanguard of the ancient world. Everyone from Egyptian pharaohs to Carthaginian generals rented this savagery. Imagine chainmail-clad, blonde, and red-haired Gallic legions fighting in the scorching heat of the Nile River. Under the shadow of the pyramids, the pharaohs of the Ptolemaic dynasty used them so much that an uncontrollable, rebelling Gallic unit in Egypt had to be imprisoned on a deserted island in the Nile so they wouldn't burn the capital to the ground. For them, it didn't matter whose war it was or which god was worshipped. All that mattered was the clash of steel and the gold poured into their tents. However, the true colossal stage where Gallic mercenaries changed the course of history took place alongside Rome's greatest nightmare, the Carthaginian commander Hannibal Barca. When Hannibal crossed the Alps with his famous march and entered Italy in 218 BC, history books always talk about the elephants, yet the true backbone of Hannibal's army was the tens of thousands of furious Gallic warriors from the Insubres and Boii tribes who joined him, believing in his promise to destroy Rome. In the Battle of Cannae, one of the bloodiest field battles in history, Hannibal deliberately placed the Gauls in the center line, the exact place where the Roman meat grinder would hit the hardest, right into the lap of death. The Gauls, with their half-naked bodies and colossal swords, absorbed the crushing power of the Roman legions for hours. They vomited blood but did not retreat a single step. Thanks to their suicidal resistance, Hannibal was able to flank the Roman army from the wings, slaughtering 50,000 Romans in a single day. Half of the blood spilled on the plains of Cannae that day belonged to the Gauls for hundreds of years. All across the world, the Gauls shed blood for the kingdoms of others, hoarded gold, and stored severed heads in their chests. They burned everything from the deserts of Alexandria to the vineyards of Italy. But while they scattered across the globe fighting other people's wars, they failed to notice the colossal apocalypse approaching their own homeland. Right at the borders of those dark oak forests, Rome had not died, despite all the heavy blows it had taken and the centuries of humiliation. On the contrary, feeding off that genetic trauma, it had transformed into a more disciplined, more ruthless, and more industrial machine of vengeance. The man who would batter down the doors of those dark forests was an ambitious dictator drowning in debt. The Gauls now had to stand shoulder to shoulder, no longer for others, but for their own homes, their own children, and their very existence, under a single banner, for the most tragic resistance history had ever seen. The fire of Vercingetorix was about to be lit. For centuries, those colossal Gallic swords that made the entire ancient world tremble on the battlefields, carrying the armies of kings on their backs as mercenaries, were finally about to face their greatest test in their own home, within those dark oak forests. By the year 58 BC, Rome was no longer that old, helpless republic that had abandoned its city in a panic. Feeding off the slaps it had endured and that freezing trauma of Metus Gallicus, it had transformed into the most ruthless and flawless military machine in history. And at the steering wheel of this industrial death machine sat a cold-blooded sociopath drowning in debt, desperately in need of blood and gold to save his political career, Julius Caesar. Caesar's entry into Gaul was not a war. It was a planned genocide. Yet, Caesar's greatest weapon was not his legions, but that toxic and lethal weakness of the Gauls' division. For centuries, the Gauls had hated each other more than anyone else in the world. Their blood feuds ran so deep that even as Caesar was burning villages in the forests, some Gallic tribes were providing provisions and cavalry support to the Roman army. With this divide-and-conquer strategy, Caesar was rotting that colossal geography from the inside out like a cancer, pitting tribes against one another. That is, until 52 BC, when a young, charismatic noble from the Arverni tribe stepped onto the stage, a man possessing a strategic intellect far beyond that of an ordinary barbarian, Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix was not one of those primitive, bloodthirsty warriors who simply burst out of the forest swinging a sword. He had served as an auxiliary cavalryman in the Roman army, memorizing Caesar's ruthless reason of state discipline and weaknesses from the inside out, down to the finest detail. Looking at his own people, he faced a bitter truth: the famous, honorable pitched battles and forest ambushes of scattered, undisciplined tribes would not be enough to halt Rome's massive logistical network. Gaul needed to become a single fist, a single army. Vercingetorix gathered the tribal chiefs, but he did not promise them peace, love, or brotherhood. He imposed upon them blood, iron, and absolute terror. Within his newly forged army, he established an empire of fear even more ruthless than that famous Roman discipline. He gouged out the eyes and cut off the ears of those who disobeyed his orders or rebelled, sending them home covered in blood to serve as a warning to others. Vercingetorix knew that to defeat the Roman monster, he had to transform into a ruthless dictator against his own people. And he succeeded. For the first time in its history, Gaul was united under the banner of a single man. Yet, Vercingetorix's true genius lay not in his sword, but in that freezing strategy that struck Caesar right in the heart. The Roman legions were a colossal engine, and this engine had only one fuel: provisions. Vercingetorix gave his army the order: you will not fight the Romans in the open field. Instead, he initiated one of the most ruthless military tactics history has ever seen: the scorched earth strategy. He ordered the Gauls to burn their own villages, their centuries-old fields, their granaries, and even their beloved cities with their own hands. Colossal flames engulfed the Gallic skies, covering the heavens in black smoke for weeks. As Caesar's legions advanced deeper into the forest, they found no army to fight. They found fields reduced to ash by flames, poisoned water wells, and a pitch-black nothingness. The Roman army slowly and agonizingly began to wither away from starvation. Vercingetorix was choking that invincible dictator not with a sword, but with hunger. However, this flawless and ruthless plan was destined to crash and shatter against the fragile wall of human emotion. When the order came to burn Avaricum, modern-day Bourges, the most beautiful and magnificent city in Gaul, the Bituriges tribe fell to Vercingetorix's feet and begged, "Let us not turn this masterpiece to ash with our own hands. The rivers and our impenetrable walls will protect us," they pleaded. Committing the greatest and deadliest mistake of his life, Vercingetorix took pity on them. He relented from burning the city, driven to the brink of madness by hunger. Caesar saw that city as an oasis brimming with provisions and descended upon Avaricum with his army like a pack of hyenas. After a ruthless siege lasting for weeks, the Roman legions breached the city. As revenge for their hunger and suffering, Caesar ordered his soldiers to leave nothing alive. On that day in Avaricum, exactly 40,000 Gauls, men, women, children, and the elderly, were put to the sword and hacked to pieces. Only 800 people managed to escape the massacre. This bone-chilling genocide at Avaricum did not weaken Vercingetorix. On the contrary, it proved the righteousness of his ruthless strategy. The Gallic people had now realized that Caesar possessed not a shred of mercy, and that the only path to salvation was absolute obedience to Vercingetorix's intellect. Fueled by this bloody motivation, Vercingetorix inflicted a colossal military defeat upon Caesar at the Battle of Gergovia, the first in the dictator's life. The Roman legions were shattered, and Caesar was forced to retreat with heavy losses, even dropping his own sword on the battlefield. Gaul was filled with hope. That invincible Roman dictator was bleeding. However, Caesar was a wounded monster, and when wounded, he stopped playing by the rules. Following that severe humiliation at Gergovia, both sides knew the final strike was approaching. With his colossal army, Vercingetorix retreated to the fortress of Alesia, situated atop a steep hill that seemed impossible to attack. He expected Caesar to attack the walls in his arrogant rage and be dashed to pieces, but Caesar did not draw his sword. He ordered his soldiers to grab their shovels. The most psychopathic, most claustrophobic siege in military history, and the final nail to be driven into the coffin of that colossal civilization, was beginning to rise around Alesia. That staggering victory at Gergovia had pumped fresh blood into Gaul's veins. spreading the scent of freedom to every corner of the forest. Knowing he lacked the power to crush the Roman army in the open field in their massive legion formation, Vercingetorix retreated with his colossal army of 80,000 to the fortress of Alesia, built atop a steep hill that seemed impossible to overcome. His plan was simple. Caesar, in his arrogant rage, would attack this steep hill. The Roman legions would be dashed to pieces at the foot of the walls, and Gaul's centuries-long resistance would be crowned with a definitive victory. However, there was a terrifying truth Vercingetorix had not accounted for. The man facing him was not an ordinary general, but a cold-blooded sociopath who turned military engineering into psychological torture. When Caesar arrived at Alesia, he did not order his soldiers to draw their swords and attack the walls. He ordered them to grab their shovels and start digging. The most claustrophobic, most sickening siege in military history began at that exact moment. With his army of approximately 50,000, Caesar drew a massive, 18-kilometer-long circle that completely surrounded the hill of Alesia. This was not just a wooden fence. This was an industrial death machine. In front of the walls, he placed deep trenches filled with water, poisoned stakes driven into the ground, which the Romans mockingly called lilies, and iron hooks. When Vercingetorix realized this colossal prison wall was closing, he was horrified. Just before it sealed, he secretly sent his last remaining cavalry units into the forest, issuing a desperate plea to all of Gaul: "Come to our aid, or the heart of Europe will starve to death here." Caesar knew very well that hundreds of thousands of Gauls would form a massive army and come after him. What a normal commander should have done was break this circle and escape that hell. But Caesar did not flee. He issued the most arrogant and psychopathic order in the world. Just behind the first wall, to defend against the incoming external army, he had a second, outward-facing wall built, 21 kilometers long. Now, there was an unbelievable, surreal scene. At the very center, 80,000 Gauls battling starvation on the hill. On the outermost perimeter, a furious Gallic relief army of 250,000 coming to save them. And right in the middle of these two colossal forces, trapped between the two wooden walls he had built himself, was a Roman army besieged from both sides. The besieger was besieged within his own trap. However, in the shadow of this colossal engineering marvel, one of the most ruthless and silent massacres in history was about to take place. Provisions in the fortress of Alesia were rapidly depleting. When it became impossible to feed 80,000 warriors, Vercingetorix made that horrific decision. He cast out those who could not fight, namely the women, children, and elderly of the Mandubi tribe, the actual natives of the fortress. His goal was for this innocent civilian population to walk to the Roman walls and be taken prisoner, so they could at least survive as slaves and fill their bellies. When the women and children arrived at the foot of that massive wall built by Rome, they fell to their knees and begged in tears, "Make us slaves. Put us in chains, but give us a piece of bread." Yet, standing before them was Rome's civilization-bringing dictator, Caesar. Caesar ordered that the gates absolutely must not be opened, and not a single crumb of bread be given. His aim was to use these civilians to crush Vercingetorix's psychology. The women and children turned back and begged at the gates of the Gallic fortress. But Vercingetorix, having no provisions either, did not open those gates. Tens of thousands of innocent people were trapped in that narrow, cursed strip of terrain, no man's land, between the fortress of their own tribe and the Roman walls. As days passed, the screams turned into moans, and the moans into a dead silence. Both armies, from behind their respective walls, watched those women and children slowly starve to death, holding on to one another. The boundary between civilization and barbarity was completely erased in the silence of the children dying between those walls. And the thing that would break that silence would be the war cries of the colossal Gallic relief army appearing on the horizon. The Gallic relief army of approximately 250,000 descended upon the Roman lines from within the forests like a flood. Simultaneously, Vercingetorix and his starving warriors inside the fortress launched an attack from within. At the most critical moment of the battle, the Gallic army found the weakest point in the Roman defensive line and began to breach the wall. The Roman legions were on the verge of panic. At that exact second, Caesar, donning his famous blood-red cape, plunged directly into the front lines, right into the middle of the hell where swords were clashing. Seeing that their leader had come to die with them, the legions began to fight with superhuman fanaticism. When the Germanic cavalry under Caesar's command slipped behind the massive Gallic army and attacked from the flanks, the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Gauls instantly turned into chaos. Hundreds of thousands of Gauls, crushed beneath Roman swords and horse hooves, retreated, scattering and vanishing deep into the forests. For Vercingetorix, watching this colossal collapse from the top of the fortress, it was all over. The next day, he put on his finest armor, adorned his horse, and rode alone toward the Roman camp. Caesar was waiting for him, seated on his throne with that cold and arrogant expression. Vercingetorix dismounted, removed his weapons and armor, and without saying a word, threw them at Caesar's feet and knelt. Caesar showed no respect or mercy. In that freezing silence, he gave a single signal to his soldiers. Vercingetorix was put in chains. Europe's freest, most terrifying leader was taken to Rome and thrown into the lightless, airless Tullianum dungeon underground. For exactly 6 years, he was kept helplessly in that pitch-black hole, amidst his own feces and the stench of rotting corpses. And when Caesar's magnificent triumph ceremony ended, he was silently executed, strangled with a rope around his neck. The death of Vercingetorix was not merely the execution of one man, but of an entire civilization. The toll of Caesar's 8-year civilization campaign was pure industrial genocide. Over 1 million Gauls were put to the sword, and over 1 million more were chained and sold in slave markets. Hundreds of cities were wiped off the map. The Druids, the mysterious lords of the forests, were ruthlessly slaughtered, hanged from trees. The sacred oak forests were cut down, and in their place, perfectly straight Roman roads, concrete temples, and arenas were built. The children of the remaining Gauls were taught Latin, forced to drink Roman wine, and compelled to dress like Romans. A flawless assimilation, a bloody cultural genocide had been completed. That colossal culture that tamed iron, burned Rome, plundered Delphi, and reached all the way to the heart of Anatolia was buried in the dark pages of history. The true barbarians were not those screaming in the forests, but those sitting in Senate seats, sipping wine while signing the death warrants of millions. From the Lords of Iron to the steppes of Anatolia, from the bloody rituals of the Druids to those claustrophobic walls of Alesia, we have reached the end of this 8-part epic of the Gauls, Europe's first true superpower. If you want these massive series to continue, where we tear down the lies of civilization and barbarity, forced upon us and shine a lantern on the bloody and freezing truths of history, do not forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Until we meet again in Dark Truths. Goodbye for now.